Hey everybody, welcome back. We are finishing up with Persepolis. As with the rest of our sort of analytical series, this is where I try to talk about my overall thoughts and feelings about the book, what we've been talking about so far, and generally try to answer the question, why this book? Why is this book worth reading? And I think that's always a valuable question to ask yourself when you've finished a book. You say, was this book worth reading? And if so, why? And my thoughts on this kind of boil down to a couple of things. One of them, as I think I mentioned in an earlier video, one of them goes back to Virginia Woolf, right? If we remember our Virginia Woolf, when she wrote A Room of One's Own, one of her concerns was that the voices of women were not represented very well. Now, she was writing in the 1920s. She was looking at sort of more classical literature. But when in her investigations, she saw women sort of just beginning to become writers and just starting to write their stories. Like prior to that, you had a lot of really fantastic and interesting female characters who were, however, written by men. You didn't have a lot of characters written by women from women's perspectives. So I think when we look at our writing pool, when we look at the authors that we read, we do want to make sure that we are reading the stories that women have written, especially when these are sort of real stories, right? When they're nonfiction, when they're memoirs, right? There's a difference to be made, I think, between, say, women writing fiction and women writing memoirs. But nevertheless, I think it is valuable to have women's points of view kind of in our heads as we're reading, and especially about Iran, and especially about Iran in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So Iran, like as we all know, I think Iran has a theocracy pretty much running it and has a lot of rules which are bound up in religious traditions. And in Islam, as with many of the Abrahamic religions, honestly, if you really kind of go by the original texts, women do not have a lot of roles to play in these cultures, in these traditions. The very, very traditional role of women is generally to keep the house and to have children and raise children and to make sure their husbands can then go off and do whatever it is that they want to do. This is true in, honestly, a lot of religions. It's an unfortunate thing. And so to have a woman growing up in this very, very, I'm going to throw the O word out there, oppressive environment, but still be able to tell her story of how she tried to adapt to that, of how she tried to still be herself in a culture that really doesn't care who women are, I think is worth reading. It's worth looking at because it's not an easy story to tell. And I think it's wonderful that she has told it to us. And, as you may have guessed, there might be some of you watching this right now who are much more sort of educated perhaps on Iran and Islam than I am. And you're already thinking, God, this guy doesn't know anything. And that's another reason to read this book, is because there are so many things that I do not know. I do not know what life was like in Iran during the fall of the Shah, during the revolution. I don't know what it's like to grow up having religious authorities tell me what I can and cannot wear, what I can and cannot do. I don't know what it's like to grow up in a country where I have to watch my behavior intensely for fear that an authority figure will come along and just arbitrarily decide that I have done something wrong and that I can be taken away. I know that there are many, many people in many, many countries who do fear that. They definitely do. And I'm very lucky that that's not a fear that I have to deal with. We'll use the word privileged, if we shall. So to be able to read these stories, especially, is a good reminder of sort of the ease with which I am able to go through life, and to be conscious of the fact that not everybody does, right? My experience is not everyone else's experience. And I think that is good for me to remember. And I think that Satrapi really is able to highlight that very well, that her experience was difficult. Her experience growing up was challenging, but nevertheless, she was able to become the woman that she wanted to become. She was able to become an artist and a writer. Her book has now been taught in many, many schools. It's around the world. It's almost certainly been banned by angrier religious authorities, I'm sure. It's been made into a film. So despite, a whole system saying, this is what we want you to be, she was able to throw that off. Of course, it did mean leaving Iran. It meant leaving her home country, which must have been terribly painful. And I think, as I mentioned in another video as well, it is difficult to have to leave your homeland in order to become the person that you need to become. And I kind of get that, as I have left mine and I've become the person I've become. So I think it is a story of courage. It is a story of remaining true to oneself. It's a story of trying to find ways to resist people telling you who you're supposed to be. And that's a really good story for a lot of people, especially, I think, for girls. As I mentioned in another video, that the class that I'll be teaching this in is mostly girls. There's one boy in the class, but it is mostly girls. And I think it is very useful to give girls, especially who are in high school, who are still kind of becoming and learning who they are, it's very useful to give girls texts that kind of tell them you can be the person that you think you are. And even though there are people who are going to try to tell you not to do that, it is very, very important that you hold on to the person that you think you are. That you, and if you don't know who that is, that you do like Marjane did. You explore it. You test things out. You try new things. You make some mistakes. You make some bad choices. But you figure that out on your terms. And I think that is really, really important. And finally, I mean, it comes down to the question of why read, not just why read this memoir, but there's a question of why read memoirs sort of in general. It's not as you may have noticed by following my videos, memoirs are not a genre of literature that I generally read a lot of. I know some people love them, but memoirs and biographies, they don't usually come across my plate. They're not stuff I'd usually pick off the shelf. Nevertheless, I think they are definitely worth reading because, as I've said before, I have one life to live, allegedly, so I'm told. I got one life, and every day that goes by and every choice that I make kind of closes doors. This is about to get a little depressing, but don't worry, you'll see where I'm going. Every choice that I make closes certain doors and say that those are things that I can no longer do, right? By for example, by living and teaching in Japan for as long as I have, that's certainly giving me opportunities here that I never would have gotten if I hadn't come here. However, if I wanted to, for example, pick up and leave and go back to the United States, I think it would be extraordinarily difficult to find a new job because I don't know, for example, if the experience I have translates to experience over there. So, I don't know. Are all those doors closed? Maybe. But nevertheless, every choice you make closes certain doors. And every choice that you make determines what your life is up until the end. And so you don't get to live other lives. You don't get to go back to a save point and say, okay, I don't like the way that I did that. I want to try something different. You don't get to go back to all your old save files and say, well, I want to start from the beginning again and try different things. That doesn't work. So by reading a memoir, you are given a glimpse into that other life, that life that could have been yours, or in my case, never would have been mine, right? There's no circumstances I can think of ever in which I would have been born a girl in the early 70s in Iran. So you can, by reading a memoir, you can get that glimpse into other lives, and you can see that not only do they have their own unique, important characteristics that are very, very particular to them, where the writer has learned very specific lessons that they are trying to put out into the world. But you can also see the similarities between everybody's life, right? It helps gain a sense of shared humanity. You can look at, for example, teenage Marjane being kind of snarky and rebellious and, accusing her parents of being, you're my jailers and all that. And I remember when I was a teenager and I was kind of, I pushed back. Because of course I did, because that's what teenagers do, right? You push back on the authorities, you push back on your parents, you go, I don't need any of you anymore, I know everything now. And then you 10 years later, you're like, wow, my parents have learned a lot in 10 years. Thank you, Mark Twain. But yeah, it really, I think reading memoirs really does help to understand that shared humanity that we all have and to realize that, despite time and location and gender and religion, there's probably a lot more similarities, honestly, than there are differences. So reading memoirs is good for that. And so for that, I recommend it. Again, I don't think I'm going to be I'm not going to be turning onto high quantities of memoirs, because again, it's not my preferred genre, but I think they are worth reading, and I should put more on my plate. If you've got a memoir that you really like, that you think is a must read, put it in the comments. I would like to hear it. So again, so I can kind of boost my my scope of reading, because if you get really, really focused into one niche, you miss out on a lot. So, long story short, too late. Definitely take a look at Persepolis if you get a chance. If you're a fan of comics and you want to see sort of how comics can be used, especially if you're a fan of superhero comics and you want to see sort of how comics can be used in a more literary fashion, right? Not to say that comic books aren't, and superhero comics aren't literature. I'll stand by that. But if you want to see how comics are used in a more literary fashion, this is a really good book to pick up. If you're interested in Iran, if you're interested in sort of people growing up, all this good stuff, I strongly recommend it. So Persepolis, good read. I think by now I kind of know what I want to talk about when I finally get to teach it in class after summer break. So thank you. Thank you for walking this journey with me and letting me ramble on and figure out what's going on in my head about this book. What's our next book? As of this recording, I do not know. I really should figure that out soon because, you know, I thought summertime I'd get a lot more work done, but wow, those naps are real good. But I promise I will keep going. I'll find a new book to write about. And in the meantime, thanks for sticking by. I always appreciate it. And come back for the next one. All right? Thanks a lot. Be well.